Have you ever wondered what happens when duty collides with conscience in the most impossible circumstances? When a single moment of mercy could cost you everything you've ever believed in? When choosing humanity over hatred becomes the most dangerous decision of your life? Tonight I'm going to share with you one of the most extraordinary and forbidden encounters from World War II. A story that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, compassion, and what it truly means to be human when the world has lost its way. Picture this. It's October 1944, and the Belgian port city of Antwerp has just been liberated by Allied forces. The streets echo with celebration as civilians emerge from years of brutal occupation. But liberation brings its own chaos, its own dangers, its own impossible choices that will test the very soul of humanity. This is the story of Elizabeth Vanair Berg, a 26-year-old Belgian nurse whose life was about to collide with destiny in the most unexpected way, and Captain Klaus Weber, a wounded German officer whose fate would hang in the balance of one woman's decision to see beyond the uniform to the human being underneath. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the drama of wartime romance. It's what these events reveal about the power of individual conscience to triumph over the machinery of hatred. It's proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, when entire nations are consumed by the thirst for vengeance, one person can still choose mercy over retribution. But before we dive into this incredible tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just another war story gathering dust in forgotten archives. This is a testament to the fact that love and compassion can bloom in the most impossible circumstances, that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it encounters another human heart in desperate need. I spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from hospital records, personal diaries, and witness testimonies that survived the chaos of liberation. What I discovered was an encounter so heart-wrenching, so impossible, and so profoundly human that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every heart-stopping close call actually happened. Elizabeth had been working as a nurse in Antwerp's main hospital since 1941, watching her city transform under German occupation from a thriving port into a fortress of fear. She had seen things that no young woman should ever witness. Families torn apart by deportations, friends disappearing in the night, the gradual erosion of everything decent and hopeful about civilized society. For 3 years, she had treated German soldiers alongside Belgian civilians, maintaining the professional distance that medical ethics demanded, while her heart burned with the memory of everything her people had endured. She had learned to see wounds rather than uniforms, to hear symptoms rather than accents, because that was the only way to maintain her sanity in a world gone mad. Klaus Weber was everything Elizabeth had been taught to hate. A captain in the Wehrmacht, he had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred to the Atlantic Wall defenses around Antwerp. He came from a family of teachers in Bavaria, had studied literature at university before the war changed everything, and had spent 2 years questioning orders that felt increasingly wrong with each passing month. The morning that would change both their lives forever began like any other during those chaotic days of liberation. The hospital was overwhelmed with casualties from the final battles for the city. Allied soldiers with shrapnel wounds, Belgian resistance fighters with bullet holes, German prisoners with injuries that ranged from minor to life-threatening. Elizabeth moved through the wards with practiced efficiency, her white uniform a beacon of calm in the storm of medical emergency that had consumed the hospital. She had worked 18-hour shifts for the past week, surviving on coffee and determination, pushing her body beyond its limits because there was simply no alternative. That's when the stretcher arrived that would test everything she believed about duty, loyalty, and the sacred oath she had taken to preserve life above all else. The patient was unconscious, his field gray uniform torn and bloodstained, a bullet wound in his shoulder that had been roughly bandaged by his own hands before he collapsed. Captain Klaus Weber had been separated from his retreating unit during the final hours of the German withdrawal from Antwerp. Caught in crossfire between advancing Canadian forces and desperate Wehrmacht rear guards, he had taken a rifle bullet through the shoulder and crawled nearly 2 miles through rubble-strewn streets before losing consciousness in an alley just blocks from the hospital. The Belgian civilians who found him faced their own impossible choice. This was a German officer, one of their oppressors, wounded and helpless in their hands. Logic demanded they leave him to die or turn him over to the advancing Allies for whatever rough justice awaited prisoners of war. Instead, they chose mercy. An elderly baker named Henry Dubois and his wife Marie loaded the unconscious German onto a cart and brought him to the hospital, not because they forgave what his uniform represented, but because they refused to let hatred turn them into the very monsters they had fought against for 4 long years. Elizabeth was checking supplies in the trauma ward when the Dubois family arrived with their unexpected cargo. She looked down at the pale face of the wounded officer and felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't the face of a Nazi fanatic from propaganda posters. This was a young man, barely older than herself, whose features spoke of sensitivity rather than cruelty, of intelligence rather than blind obedience. His breathing was shallow, labored. The makeshift bandage on his shoulder was soaked through with blood that had dried to a dark crimson. His pulse was weak but steady. Medical training told her he would live if he received proper treatment. Professional ethics demanded she provide that treatment regardless of nationality or uniform. But standing over Captain Klaus Weber in that moment, Elizabeth faced something far more complex than medical protocol. Around her, other staff members watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Belgian patients in nearby beds muttered angry words about wasting resources on German soldiers when their own people needed care. The head physician, Dr. Martens, approached with steps that echoed through the ward like a judgment. His face was unreadable, but Elizabeth could sense the weight of decision pressing down on all of them. This wasn't just another patient. This was a test of everything they claimed to believe about healing, about forgiveness, about what separated civilization from barbarism. What happened next would determine not just the fate of one wounded German officer, but the trajectory of 2 lives that were about to become intertwined in ways neither could have imagined. Elizabeth looked into the unconscious face of Captain Klaus Weber and made a choice that would echo through decades. She began to work. Her hands moved with practiced precision, cutting away the blood-soaked uniform to expose the wound, assessing the damage with the cool efficiency that had carried her through 3 years of wartime medicine. The bullet had passed through the shoulder cleanly, missing major arteries, but causing significant tissue damage that would require careful attention to heal properly. As she worked, Elizabeth found herself studying the man beneath her hands. His skin was pale from blood loss, but unmarked by the harsh lines of cruelty she had expected to see in a German officer. His hands, when she examined them for additional injuries, were soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who had held books more often than weapons. The other patients watched this drama unfold with fascination and growing anger. Here was their nurse, their Belgian sister, treating a German officer with the same careful attention she had shown to resistance fighters and Allied soldiers. Some began to voice their disapproval in whispers that grew steadily louder. But Elizabeth continued her work, guided by something deeper than political loyalty or national hatred. She had taken an oath to preserve life wherever she found it threatened, and that oath made no exceptions for uniform color or accent. Her conscience wouldn't allow her to abandon a wounded human being, regardless of what flag he had followed into battle. Klaus stirred as she cleaned the wound, his eyes fluttering open to reveal pupils dilated with pain and confusion. For a moment he seemed lost, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the face looking down at him with professional concern rather than the hatred he had expected. When he tried to speak, the words came out in accented French, carefully pronounced despite his obvious pain. He thanked her for helping him, asked where he was, wondered aloud if he was dreaming that someone was showing him kindness after everything his people had done to hers. Elizabeth found herself responding in German, surprising both of them with her fluency in his native language. She had studied it at university before the war, never imagining she would use it to comfort a wounded enemy soldier in a Belgian hospital during the chaos of liberation. Their conversation was brief, conducted in whispers while she worked to stabilize his condition. But in those few minutes, something extraordinary began to happen. Two human beings looked past uniforms and flags and political divisions to recognize something essential in each other. Something that would grow into the most dangerous and impossible connection either had ever experienced. The foundation was being laid for a love story that would defy every rule of war, every expectation of loyalty, every rational consideration of safety and survival. Neither Elizabeth nor Klaus understood yet what was beginning between them. They knew only that in a world consumed by hatred, they had found an unexpected moment of grace that felt worth protecting at any cost. Any cost. The hours that followed Klaus's awakening passed in a blur of careful medical attention and growing awareness of just how precarious their situation had become. Elizabeth found herself returning to his bedside far more often than medical necessity demanded, drawn by conversations that began with clinical assessments, but evolved into something far more personal and dangerous. Klaus spoke of his hometown in Bavaria, describing morning walks through forests where his father had taught him to identify every species of tree by the shape of their leaves. He talked about the university where he had studied medieval literature, about professors who had opened his mind to worlds beyond the narrow confines of military service. Elizabeth shared her own memories of life before the occupation, painting pictures with words of summer evenings spent reading in her family's garden, of medical school, where she had discovered her calling to heal rather than harm. She described the gradual transformation of her beloved Antwerp from a city of culture and commerce into a place where fear ruled every human interaction. Their conversations revealed two people who had more in common than either had dared to hope. Both loved poetry, though Klaus favored Rilke while Elizabeth preferred Baudelaire. Both had dreamed of traveling after the war, of seeing places that existed only in books and imagination. Both carried guilt about the things they had been forced to witness, to participate in, to accept as the price of survival in a world gone insane. But even as these connections deepened, the danger of their situation became increasingly apparent. Other hospital staff began to notice Elizabeth's unusual attention to the German patient, the way she lingered at his bedside during her rounds, the animated conversations that seemed to transcend the professional distance expected between nurse and enemy prisoner. Dr. Martens called her into his office on Klaus's third day at the hospital, his weathered face grave with concern that went far beyond medical protocol. He had watched Elizabeth work for 3 years, had seen her dedication to every patient who passed through their doors, but this situation was different in ways that could prove catastrophic for everyone involved. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Elizabeth's life. How could she explain that she saw more than an enemy soldier when she looked at Klaus Weber? How could she describe the way their talks had awakened parts of herself that she thought the war had killed forever? How could she make Dr. Martens understand that her growing feelings for this German officer felt not like betrayal, but like the first honest emotion she had experienced in years? Dr. Martens listened with the patience of someone who had guided countless young medical professionals through moral crises, but his final words carried weight that Elizabeth felt like physical blows. The hospital's position in the newly liberated city was precarious, dependent on maintaining credibility with both Allied military authorities and the Belgian civilian population. Any appearance of collaboration with former occupiers could result in the closure of their facility and the end of their mission to heal the wounded. That evening, as Elizabeth made her rounds through wards filled with the casualties of liberation, She carried the weight of impossible choices. Klaus would be transferred to a prisoner of war facility within days, processed through military channels that would separate them forever. Yet the thought of losing him felt like losing a part of herself that she had only just discovered. Klaus sensed the change in her demeanor during their next conversation, reading the conflict in her eyes with the intuition of someone who had learned to recognize emotional subtlety during months of questioning his own role in an increasingly senseless war. When she finally told him about the planned transfer, he accepted the news with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned not to expect mercy from a world that dealt primarily in violence. But acceptance and surrender were not the same thing, and Klaus found himself fighting against despair as he contemplated a future that stretched ahead without Elizabeth's presence to make sense of the chaos around him. She had become his anchor to sanity, his proof that goodness could still exist even in circumstances designed to destroy every decent human impulse. Their final conversations took on an urgency that bordered on desperation, as both realized their time together was measured in hours rather than days. They spoke not just of their growing feelings, but of dreams that seemed impossibly distant. Klaus described the small cottage he hoped to buy after the war, complete with a garden where Elizabeth could grow the medicinal herbs she had studied in university. Elizabeth painted pictures of quiet evenings spent reading together, of children who would know only peace, of growing old without fear or hiding. These fantasies felt both essential and cruel, necessary anchors to hope that might prove to be nothing more than beautiful lies they told themselves to make separation bearable. Yet they clung to these visions of reunion as they prepared for what both understood might be their final goodbye. The night before Klaus's scheduled transfer, Elizabeth made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She couldn't save him from military custody, couldn't change the larger forces that were tearing their world apart. But she could give him something to carry forward, some tangible reminder that their connection had been real and meaningful despite its brief duration. She brought him a book of poetry that had belonged to her father, its pages worn soft by countless readings during the long years of occupation. Inside the front cover, she had written words in careful German script that spoke of hope for reunion, of love that transcended the artificial boundaries war had created between their nations. Klaus accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, understanding the enormous risk Elizabeth was taking by giving an enemy prisoner something so personal and identifiable. In return, he pressed into her palm a small wooden cross that he had carved during long evenings in field hospitals on the Eastern Front, whittling away at pieces of wood, while other soldiers wrote letters to sweethearts they might never see again. The cross was simple, unadorned, but it had been shaped by hands that had found peace in creation rather than destruction. It represented everything Klaus wanted Elizabeth to remember about him, not the uniform he wore or the army he served, but the man who had learned to see beauty in small things while surrounded by horror. Their final embrace was conducted in whispers and shadows, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of hospital corridors and the distant sounds of a city learning to celebrate freedom. Neither knew when or if they would see each other again, but both understood that something fundamental had changed in their understanding of love, loyalty, and what it meant to choose hope over hatred in humanity's darkest hour. The morning light that crept through the hospital windows illuminated a ward that looked no different from any other military medical facility, but Elizabeth knew that something extraordinary had taken place within these walls. Two hearts had found each other across the vast divide of war, proving that human connection could bloom even in soil poisoned by years of systematic cruelty. As military vehicles arrived to transport Klaus and other German prisoners to processing centers, Elizabeth stood at her station with professional composure, but her hand rested against the small wooden cross hidden beneath her uniform. The weight of it against her chest served as proof that their impossible love had been real, that mercy could triumph over vengeance when individual courage chose compassion over convenience. Klaus was loaded into a transport truck with other wounded prisoners, his eyes finding Elizabeth's face one final time through the hospital window. The look that passed between them carried promises neither could voice aloud, commitments that would have to survive on memory and hope rather than daily contact. The truck disappeared into the morning traffic of liberated Antwerp, carrying Klaus toward an uncertain future, while leaving Elizabeth to face the consequences of choices that had changed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about love, duty, and the price of following her heart into unknown territory. But their story was far from over, and the challenges that lay ahead would test both of them in ways neither could have imagined during those brief, precious days when love had bloomed in the shadows of war. The real test of their impossible connection was just beginning. The weeks that followed Klaus's departure stretched before Elizabeth like an endless winter, each day marked by the absence of conversations that had become as essential to her as breathing. The hospital resumed its normal rhythms of healing and recovery, but everything felt different now, charged with memories of whispered exchanges and stolen moments that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Elizabeth threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, treating the steady stream of patients who arrived with injuries both physical and psychological. Liberation had brought its own casualties, people who had survived years of occupation only to find themselves struggling to adapt to freedom, to trust that the nightmare was truly over. She moved through the wards with practiced efficiency, checking wounds, dispensing medications, offering comfort to those who called out in their sleep for loved ones who might never return. But beneath her professional exterior, she carried the weight of Klaus's memory like a secret flame that no amount of routine could extinguish. The small wooden cross he had given her became her most treasured possession, worn against her skin, where its familiar weight served as a constant reminder of what they had shared. During quiet moments between shifts, she would trace its simple lines with her fingertips, remembering the careful precision with which he had carved each detail during those long nights on distant battlefields. Meanwhile, Klaus found himself processed through the machinery of military detention with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all aspects of post-war administration. He was transported first to a temporary holding facility outside Brussels, then to a larger prisoner of war camp in northern France, where thousands of German soldiers awaited repatriation to a homeland that many no longer recognized. The camp was a study in organized despair, row upon row of barracks housing men who had been torn away from everything familiar and thrust into a limbo that might last months or years. Some prisoners maintained military discipline, organizing themselves into informal units that provided structure and purpose. Others retreated into themselves, becoming ghosts who moved through daily routines without any visible connection to the world around them. Klaus occupied a middle ground between these extremes, participating in camp activities when required, but spending most of his free time in solitary contemplation of the book Elizabeth had given him. The poetry within its worn pages became his lifeline to sanity, each verse a bridge back to those precious conversations that had revealed the possibility of love transcending hatred. He read Baudelaire's words with new understanding, finding in the French poet's exploration of beauty and decay a mirror for his own experience of discovering grace in the midst of destruction. The inscription Elizabeth had written in careful German script became his daily prayer, a reminder that somewhere beyond the barbed wire and guard towers, someone was thinking of him with the same intensity he brought to thoughts of her. Letters became their only connection across the vast distances that separated them, though even this fragile link required enormous ingenuity to maintain. Elizabeth discovered that the International Red Cross maintained lists of prisoner locations, though obtaining specific information required patience and careful navigation of bureaucratic channels that moved with glacial slowness. Her first letter took 6 weeks to reach Klaus, traveling through official mail systems that scrutinized every word for security violations or inappropriate content. When he finally held the familiar handwriting in his hands, Klaus felt tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed since childhood. Here was proof that their connection had survived separation, that love could endure even when sustained by nothing more than memory and hope. The correspondence that developed between them over the following months became a masterwork of coded communication, superficially innocent exchanges about books and weather that carried deeper messages of affection and longing. Elizabeth wrote about her work at the hospital, describing new techniques she was learning and colleagues who reminded her of people they had discussed. Klaus responded with observations about camp life, fellow prisoners who shared interests in literature and philosophy, small victories in maintaining dignity under circumstances designed to strip away individual identity. But beneath these surface topics ran a deeper current of emotional intimacy that grew stronger with each exchange. They wrote about dreams that had sustained them through the darkest periods of separation, about moments when they had felt the other's presence so strongly that physical distance seemed irrelevant. Elizabeth described standing in the hospital garden at sunset, watching light fade from the sky while imagining Klaus seeing the same stars from his barracks window. Klaus wrote about morning formations where he would study the faces of other prisoners and think about Elizabeth's dedication to healing, about how her example had taught him to see humanity in places where others found only despair. Their letters also revealed the practical challenges each faced in maintaining hope for reunion. Elizabeth wrote about the suspicion she encountered from colleagues who questioned her interest in corresponding with a German prisoner, about social pressures that demanded she demonstrate proper patriotic feelings by rejecting any connection to former enemies. Klaus described the complex politics of prison camp life, where association with the outside world could be viewed as either privilege or betrayal, depending on the shifting allegiances among his fellow captives. Yet both persisted in maintaining their correspondence, treating each letter as a sacred commitment that transcended the convenient categories of friend and enemy, ally and opponent. Their love had become an act of resistance against the forces that sought to reduce human relationships to simple equations of national loyalty and political expedience. As 1945 turned into 1946, the larger world began the slow process of transition from war to peace. But for Elizabeth and Klaus, the future remained achingly uncertain. Prisoner repatriation programs were announced and delayed, modified and canceled, leaving thousands of men in bureaucratic limbo, while governments struggled to manage the enormous logistics of reshaping Europe. Elizabeth followed these developments with the intensity of someone whose personal happiness depended on decisions being made in distant conference rooms by officials who would never know or care about the individual lives affected by their policies. She wrote letters to Red Cross officials, contacted politicians who might have influence over repatriation schedules, and researched immigration procedures that might allow Klaus to remain in Belgium rather than return to a Germany that had been carved up among occupying powers. Klaus, meanwhile, faced his own set of impossible choices as opportunities for early release began to appear for prisoners who could demonstrate useful skills or political reliability. Medical personnel were among the first groups considered for repatriation, as post-war Germany desperately needed healthcare workers to treat civilian populations devastated by years of bombing and malnutrition. But accepting early release would mean returning to Bavaria without any guarantee that he would be able to contact Elizabeth, much less arrange for reunion. The German postal system was in chaos, civilian movement was restricted, and the border between Germany and Belgium might as well have been on different planets for all the communication it allowed. The choice between freedom and love became the central dilemma of Klaus's existence, a decision that kept him awake during long nights when other prisoners slept peacefully in their bunks. Freedom without Elizabeth felt like another form of prison, while remaining in captivity at least preserved the possibility of their correspondence continuing until circumstances changed. Their letters from this period revealed two people grappling with questions that had no easy answers, choices that would determine not just their individual futures, but the fate of a love that had already survived impossible odds. Elizabeth wrote about her willingness to leave Belgium, to follow Klaus wherever his repatriation might take him. Despite the enormous risks such a decision would entail for someone with no legal status in occupied Germany. Klaus responded with detailed descriptions of the devastation he had witnessed during his final months of military service, painting a picture of his homeland that bore little resemblance to the peaceful Bavaria he had described during their hospital conversations. Cities reduced to rubble, families scattered across refugee camps, an entire society struggling to rebuild from foundations that had been shattered by total war. Yet even these sobering realities could not diminish their determination to find a way forward together. Their love had been forged in circumstances that should have made any connection impossible, had grown stronger through months of separation that would have destroyed relationships built on less solid foundations. They had proven to themselves and to each other that human hearts could recognize no boundaries when they encountered their perfect match. The spring of 1946 brought news that would test their commitment in ways neither had anticipated. Klaus's name appeared on a repatriation list scheduled for early summer, marking him for transport to the American occupation zone in southern Germany, where he would begin the process of civilian reintegration. The notification reached Elizabeth through channels she had cultivated within the Red Cross administrative network, arriving like a thunderbolt that illuminated both opportunity and crisis in equal measure. Klaus would finally be free, but free in a country she could not legally enter, in circumstances that might make communication impossible, with no guarantee that their love could survive the transition from wartime correspondence to peacetime reality. Their final exchange of letters before his repatriation carried the weight of everything they had shared and everything they hoped to build together. Elizabeth wrote about her plans to find a way across the German border, about connections she was developing with relief organizations that might provide cover for what would essentially be an illegal immigration. Klaus responded with detailed instructions about how to find him in Bavaria, about family members who might provide shelter, about the new identity papers that would mark his transition from prisoner of war to civilian citizen. But underneath these practical arrangements lay deeper questions that neither could fully address through written words. Would their love survive the test of daily contact after months of idealized correspondence? Could they build a real life together in a world that would view their relationship as suspicious at best, treasonous at worst? Were they strong enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead? Or would reality prove too harsh for emotions that had been nurtured in the artificial environment of separation and longing? The answers to these questions lay somewhere in the uncertain future that stretched ahead of them, a future that would demand every ounce of courage and commitment they had discovered in themselves during their impossible courtship. Their love story was about to enter its most dangerous phase, where dreams would either become reality or shatter against the harsh edges of a world still struggling to heal from years of systematic hatred. The day of Klaus's departure from the prisoner of war camp arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes momentous events feel surreal. Elizabeth had spent weeks preparing for this moment, yet when it finally came, she felt completely unprepared for the magnitude of what lay ahead. She had managed to secure a position with a Belgian relief organization that was coordinating aid efforts in the American occupation zone of Germany. The paperwork was legitimate, the mission genuine, but Elizabeth's true purpose for crossing into Germany had nothing to do with humanitarian work and everything to do with the man she had fallen in love with in a hospital ward 18 months earlier. The journey from Antwerp to Bavaria took 3 days by train, passing through landscapes that bore witness to the systematic destruction of an entire continent. Elizabeth pressed her face against the window as they crossed into Germany, watching mile after mile of bombed cities and abandoned villages scroll past like scenes from a nightmare that refused to end. Every destroyed building told a story of lives interrupted, families scattered, dreams buried beneath rubble that might take decades to clear. She found herself thinking about Klaus's descriptions of his homeland, wondering how much of the beauty he had painted with words still existed beneath the scars of total war. The refugee camp, where Klaus was scheduled for processing, sat in a valley surrounded by hills that had once been covered with vineyards. Now the slopes were dotted with temporary structures housing thousands of displaced persons from across Europe, all waiting for bureaucratic decisions that would determine where they could rebuild their lives. Elizabeth arrived at the camp headquarters 2 days before Klaus's expected release, using her official credentials to gain access to processing areas, where she hoped to intercept him before he disappeared into the chaos of civilian reintegration. The camp commandant, a tired American major named Harrison, welcomed her presence as additional help with the overwhelming administrative burden of managing human displacement on an unprecedented scale. For 48 hours, Elizabeth worked alongside camp personnel, helping to process paperwork and coordinate transportation for released prisoners, while her eyes constantly scanned crowds of men in civilian clothes who had traded military uniforms for whatever garments relief organizations could provide. The waiting was agony, filled with moments when she thought she recognized Klaus's profile in a distant group, only to realize her eyes were playing tricks born of desperate hope and exhaustion. She began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake, if the Klaus she remembered from their hospital conversations existed only in her imagination, if the months of correspondence had built a connection that could never survive the test of physical reunion. Then, on a Wednesday morning that started like any other, she saw him walking toward the processing center with a group of other released prisoners. Even from a distance, even wearing clothes that hung loosely on his frame, even with his hair longer than military regulations had allowed, she recognized the careful way he moved, the slight tilt of his head that she remembered from their whispered conversations in the ward. Klaus saw her at the same moment, stopping so suddenly that the man behind him nearly collided with his back. For several seconds, they stared at each other across 50 yards of dusty ground, both trying to convince themselves that what they were seeing was real rather than another cruel trick of memory and longing. When Klaus began walking toward her, his steps careful and deliberate, Elizabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs with an intensity that made breathing difficult. This was the moment they had dreamed about for months, written about in coded letters, planned for despite impossible odds. Yet now that it was happening, neither seemed to know how to bridge the distance between anticipation and reality. They stopped 3 feet apart, close enough to touch, but separated by months of uncertainty and the weight of everything that had changed since their last conversation in a Belgian hospital. Klaus looked older, his face marked by experiences that letters could never fully convey. Elizabeth appeared different too, her features sharpened by the responsibility she had carried during their separation. When Klaus spoke her name, his voice carried the same gentle precision she remembered from their late-night conversations, but underneath lay new depths of emotion that made the simple words sound like a prayer answered. Elizabeth reached toward him with trembling fingers, touching his face to confirm that he was real, that their impossible journey toward each other had actually succeeded. Their embrace, when it finally came, felt like the resolution of a symphony that had been building toward this moment for 18 months. They held each other with the desperate intensity of people who had learned never to take human connection for granted, who understood that love was something to be treasured rather than assumed. But even as they celebrated their reunion, both were acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead. Klaus's release papers gave him 30 days to report to local authorities in his hometown of Garmisch-Partenkirchen, where he would begin the process of denazification that all former Wehrmacht personnel faced before being allowed full civilian status. Elizabeth's position with the relief organization provided cover for her presence in Germany, but only for a limited time and only within certain geographical boundaries. Their reunion, miraculous as it felt, was taking place under circumstances that remained precarious and potentially dangerous for both of them. That evening, in a small inn near the refugee camp where Elizabeth had arranged accommodation, they finally had the privacy to talk without fear of being overheard or interrupted. The conversation that unfolded over the next several hours revealed how much both had changed during their months of separation, how their love had deepened despite the distance, and how uncertain their future remained despite their successful reunion. Klaus spoke about the psychological journey he had undergone during his imprisonment, the way correspondence with Elizabeth had sustained him through periods when despair threatened to overwhelm his ability to envision any meaningful future. He described fellow prisoners who had lost hope entirely, who moved through daily routines like sleepwalkers, waiting for either death or release with equal indifference. Elizabeth shared her own struggles with maintaining hope during the long months of uncertainty, the social pressure she had faced for maintaining contact with a German prisoner, the moments when she had questioned whether their connection could survive the test of separation and time. But they also talked about the practical realities that would determine whether their love could translate into a sustainable life together. Klaus would need to find work in a country where former soldiers faced widespread suspicion and limited opportunities. Elizabeth would need to secure legal status that would allow her to remain in Germany beyond her temporary assignment with the relief organization. Most challenging of all, they would need to navigate the complex social dynamics of post-war Germany, where relationships that crossed national boundaries were viewed with suspicion by both German civilians and occupation authorities. Their love story, beautiful as it felt to them, would appear to others as evidence of collaboration, opportunism, or worse. Yet as they talked through the night, sharing fears and hopes with the honesty that had characterized their correspondence, both felt their commitment to each other strengthening rather than wavering. They had already overcome impossible odds to reach this moment. The challenges ahead, daunting as they appeared, felt manageable when faced together. Klaus described his plan to return to university, to complete the literature degree that military service had interrupted, to build a career that would allow him to contribute something positive to a world that had seen too much destruction. Elizabeth spoke about her dream of establishing a medical clinic that would serve refugees and displaced persons, people who had fallen through the cracks of official aid programs. Their individual dreams began to merge into shared visions of a life built around service to others, around the kind of healing that went beyond treating physical wounds to address the psychological and spiritual damage that war had inflicted on an entire generation. They talked about children they hoped to raise, about values they wanted to pass on, about the kind of world they could help create if they had the courage to persist through whatever obstacles lay ahead. The inn where they spent that first night together was modest, its rooms furnished with the basic necessities that were all most establishments could offer in a country still struggling with severe shortages. But to Elizabeth and Klaus, surrounded by each other's presence after 18 months of separation, it felt like the most luxurious accommodation imaginable. They fell asleep holding hands, their fingers intertwined as naturally as if they had never been apart, their breathing synchronizing in the way that happens between people whose hearts have learned to beat in rhythm despite being separated by hundreds of miles and countless obstacles. Morning brought the harsh light of practical considerations that could no longer be postponed. Klaus's travel papers required him to continue his journey to Bavaria within the next few days. Elizabeth's relief organization expected her to report to their Frankfurt headquarters for new assignment instructions. Their reunion, precious as it had been, was taking place in a bubble of temporary circumstances that would soon burst. But they had proven something important to themselves during their night of conversation and reconnection. Their love had not only survived the test of separation, but had grown stronger and more resilient. They were no longer the frightened young people who had met in a hospital ward during the chaos of liberation. They had become adults who understood that true love required more than emotion, that it demanded practical commitment and the willingness to make sacrifices for something larger than individual comfort. The decisions they would make over the next few days would determine whether their impossible love story would continue or end in the kind of bittersweet separation that characterized so many wartime romances. But as they prepared to face those decisions, both carried the confidence that came from knowing they had already accomplished something miraculous simply by finding each other again in a world that had tried its best to keep them apart. Their love had become more than personal emotion. It had evolved into a form of resistance against the forces that sought to divide humanity into categories of worthy and unworthy, friend and enemy, us and them. In choosing each other, they were also choosing a vision of the world where individual hearts could triumph over collective hatred, where love could bloom even in soil poisoned by years of systematic cruelty. The morning light streaming through the inn windows illuminated two people who had been transformed by their impossible journey toward each other. They had discovered that love was not just about finding someone who completed you, but about becoming someone worthy of being loved completely. Their story was entering its final chapter, where dreams would either become reality or be sacrificed on the altar of practical necessity. But whatever happened next, they had already proven that human connection could transcend any boundary when sustained by genuine commitment and the courage to follow one's heart into unknown territory. Their love had become a testament to the power of individual choice to create meaning and beauty, even in circumstances designed to destroy both qualities. The real test of their relationship was just beginning, but they would face it together, armed with the knowledge that they had already overcome odds that should have made their reunion impossible. Sometimes the greatest victories are the quietest ones, measured not in public recognition, but in private moments when two hearts recognize they have found their home in each other despite every obstacle the world has placed in their path. The next few days unfolded with the careful choreography of two people learning to navigate love in the harsh light of post-war reality. Klaus's temporary papers required him to check in with American military authorities every 48 hours, a reminder that despite his civilian clothes, he remained under scrutiny as a former enemy combatant whose loyalty was still being evaluated. Elizabeth used her credentials with the relief organization to extend her stay in the area, claiming she needed additional time to complete assessments of refugee needs in the surrounding districts. The paperwork was convincing enough to satisfy her supervisors, but she knew this reprieve was temporary, measured in days rather than weeks. They spent their mornings walking through the countryside surrounding the refugee camp, following paths that wound between fields where farmers were attempting to coax crops from soil that had been churned by tank treads and poisoned by chemical explosives. The landscape bore scars that would take generations to heal, but there were also signs of renewal, green shoots pushing through damaged earth with the stubborn persistence of life asserting itself against destruction. These walks became their classroom for learning each other in ways that letters could never convey. Elizabeth discovered that Klaus had a habit of stopping to examine wildflowers that grew in the most unlikely places, his fingers gentle as he identified species that had somehow survived the systematic devastation of total war. She learned that he carried a small notebook where he recorded observations about nature's resilience, fragments of poetry that occurred to him during quiet moments, sketches of birds that had returned to nest in the ruins of bombed villages. Klaus found himself mesmerized by Elizabeth's ability to see medical needs in every situation they encountered. She would pause to examine an elderly refugee's persistent cough, notice signs of malnutrition in children playing in the camp, identify symptoms of psychological trauma in the haunted expressions of displaced persons waiting for news of missing family members. Her healing instincts had become so deeply ingrained that she could not turn them off even during moments meant for personal connection. But it was during their evening conversations that they truly began to understand what building a life together would require. The practical obstacles were daunting enough. Klaus would need to navigate the denazification process that determined which former military personnel could be trusted with civilian responsibilities. Elizabeth would need to find legal pathways that would allow her to remain in Germany beyond her temporary humanitarian assignment. More challenging than bureaucratic hurdles were the social realities they would face as a couple whose relationship crossed national lines that many people considered sacred. Klaus described encounters with other former prisoners who viewed any connection to Allied nationals as collaboration or betrayal of German solidarity. Elizabeth shared stories of colleagues who had questioned her loyalty for maintaining correspondence with an enemy soldier, suggesting that proper patriotic feeling required complete rejection of personal connections that transcended political boundaries. Yet these external pressures only strengthened their resolve to prove that love could transcend the artificial divisions that politics had created between their peoples. They began developing strategies for presenting their relationship in ways that emphasized shared values rather than conflicting nationalities, focusing on their mutual commitment to healing and reconstruction rather than the circumstances of their wartime meeting. Klaus spoke about his growing certainty that his future lay not in returning to the traditional life his family had planned for him, but in pursuing studies that would allow him to work with refugees and displaced persons. His months in prisoner of war camps had given him insights into the psychological needs of people torn away from everything familiar, and he believed these experiences could be channeled into meaningful service. Elizabeth described her evolving vision of medical work that went beyond treating individual symptoms to address the systemic damage that war had inflicted on entire communities. She wanted to establish clinics that served not just physical ailments, but the emotional and spiritual wounds that would affect survivors for decades to come. Their individual aspirations began to merge into a shared mission that felt larger than romance, more enduring than personal happiness. They were talking about dedicating their lives to healing the kinds of wounds they had both witnessed, using their own experience of finding connection across enemy lines as proof that reconciliation was possible even between peoples who had been taught to hate each other. The relief organization's headquarters in Frankfurt became their next destination, though for different reasons than either had originally planned. Elizabeth needed to report for new assignment instructions, but she also intended to research opportunities for establishing medical programs that would require bilingual staff with experience treating both German and Allied personnel. Klaus would travel separately, using his transit papers to move toward his mandatory reporting destination in Bavaria, while maintaining contact through carefully planned stops at locations where they could meet without arousing suspicion. The logistics of coordinating their movements required the same careful planning they had once used to maintain correspondence across enemy lines. Their separation at the refugee camp felt different from their previous goodbyes, marked by confidence rather than despair, by shared purpose rather than helpless longing. They had proven to themselves and to each other that their connection could survive the transition from wartime correspondence to peacetime reality. Now they needed to discover whether it could survive the practical challenges of building a life together in a world still struggling to define what peace would look like. The train that carried Elizabeth toward Frankfurt passed through landscapes that told the story of Germany's collapse and gradual resurrection. Cities reduced to rubble were showing signs of reconstruction, though the pace was slow and the resources limited. Refugee camps dotted the countryside like temporary cities housing millions of displaced persons whose futures remained uncertain. Elizabeth found herself studying the faces of other passengers, wondering about the stories behind their careful expressions, the losses they had endured, the hopes they carried for whatever came next. Many were refugees themselves, carrying their possessions in makeshift bundles, speaking in languages she couldn't identify, heading toward destinations that might or might not welcome their arrival. The train compartment became a microcosm of post-war Europe, filled with people whose lives had been disrupted by forces beyond their control, all trying to find ways forward in a world where the old certainties had been shattered. Elizabeth realized that her own story was not unique in its displacement and uncertainty, though it was perhaps unusual in its element of hope. Klaus's journey toward Bavaria took him through territory he had last seen during the final chaotic months of the war, when German forces were retreating on all fronts and civilian populations were fleeing ahead of advancing Allied armies. Now the same landscapes showed signs of tentative recovery, though the scars of systematic bombing remained visible everywhere. He spent one night in a village where he had been billeted during his final leave before capture, staying in the same inn where he had once written letters to family members he wasn't sure he would see again. The innkeeper remembered him, though her greeting was cautious, marked by the wariness that characterized most interactions between former soldiers and civilian populations who were still processing their own survival. The conversation that developed over a simple dinner revealed the complex emotions that many Germans felt toward former Wehrmacht personnel. There was sympathy for young men who had been conscripted into service they hadn't chosen, anger at the leadership that had led the country into catastrophic defeat, and uncertainty about how to move forward when the recent past remained so painful and controversial. Klaus found himself defending not his military service, which he had come to view as a mistake imposed by circumstances beyond his control, but his right to envision a different future than the one that traditional expectations would have provided. When he mentioned his plans to work with refugee populations, the innkeeper's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching respect. The relief organization's Frankfurt headquarters occupied a requisitioned office building that had somehow survived the intensive bombing that had devastated much of the city center. Elizabeth reported to supervisors who were managing humanitarian operations across the American occupation zone, coordinating aid programs that struggled to address needs that seemed to expand faster than resources could be allocated. Her interviews with program directors revealed opportunities she hadn't anticipated. The organization was planning to establish medical clinics in areas with high concentrations of displaced persons, facilities that would require staff with language skills and experience treating diverse populations. Elizabeth's background made her an ideal candidate for supervisory positions that would allow her to remain in Germany while pursuing exactly the kind of work she had discussed with Klaus. But accepting such positions would require commitments that extended far beyond her original humanitarian assignment. She would need to sign contracts that bound her to specific locations for minimum periods, undergo training programs that would consume months of preparation, and submit to background investigations that would scrutinize every aspect of her wartime activities. The application process included questions about her associations with German personnel during the occupation, inquiries that made her realize how carefully she would need to present her relationship with Klaus to avoid jeopardizing both their futures. Their love story would need to be framed not as personal romance, but as professional collaboration that had evolved into deeper connection through shared commitment to healing and reconciliation. Klaus's arrival in Garmisch-Partenkirchen brought him face to face with family members who had survived the war, but been transformed by their experiences in ways that made reunion complicated rather than celebratory. His parents had aged dramatically during his absence, their faces marked by the stress of wondering whether their son would return alive, their home reduced to a few rooms in a building that had been partially destroyed by Allied bombing. The conversations that unfolded over his first days home revealed the extent to which the war had changed everyone it touched. His father, once a proud teacher who had believed in the importance of education and cultural development, now spoke primarily about survival, about finding enough food and fuel to make it through another winter, about navigating the bureaucratic requirements that governed every aspect of civilian life under occupation. His mother asked careful questions about his plans for the future, but Klaus could sense her assumption that those plans would involve settling down in familiar surroundings, finding local work, marrying someone from their social circle, and rebuilding the kind of traditional life that had existed before the war disrupted everything. When Klaus mentioned Elizabeth, describing her as a colleague he had worked with on refugee issues, his parents' reactions were polite but reserved. The idea that their son might form a permanent attachment to someone from outside their community, particularly someone whose nationality connected her to the forces that had defeated Germany, was clearly difficult for them to process. Yet Klaus also sensed their desperate desire for him to find happiness and stability after years of uncertainty about his survival. Their reservations about Elizabeth were based on concern for his welfare rather than hostility toward her personally, and he believed that meeting her in person would help them understand what had drawn him to someone whose background differed so dramatically from their own expectations. The denazification process that all former military personnel faced proved less traumatic than Klaus had anticipated. His record showed no involvement with war crimes. His service had been primarily defensive rather than offensive, and character witnesses testified to his fundamental decency and his family's lack of enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. More importantly, his stated intentions to work with refugee populations and pursue advanced education in literature and psychology were viewed favorably by American officials who were trying to identify Germans who could contribute to democratic reconstruction rather than pose security risks. The clearance he received opened doors to university admission and employment opportunities that had seemed impossible during his months of imprisonment. Klaus found himself accepted into programs at Munich University that would allow him to complete his interrupted education while preparing for the kind of humanitarian work he and Elizabeth had discussed. But success in navigating bureaucratic requirements only highlighted the personal challenges that remained unresolved. Elizabeth's letters from Frankfurt described promising developments in her own career opportunities, but also the increasing pressure she felt to make definitive commitments about her future in Germany. Their correspondence during this period revealed two people who were succeeding individually while struggling to coordinate their separate achievements into a shared life. The practical obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable were gradually being resolved, but new complications emerged as their professional opportunities pulled them in different directions geographically and temporally. Elizabeth's assignment to establish a medical clinic near the French border would provide exactly the kind of work she had dreamed of, but it would also place her hundreds of miles from Munich, where Klaus would be pursuing his studies. His university program included research opportunities that could lead to important positions with international relief organizations, but the academic schedule would conflict with Elizabeth's clinic responsibilities in ways that might make regular contact impossible. The letters they exchanged during late spring of 1946 carried a different quality than their earlier correspondence, marked by practical concerns rather than romantic longing, by detailed planning rather than emotional expression. They were no longer separated by military custody and bureaucratic restrictions, but by choices they needed to make about career paths that would determine where and how they could build a life together. The irony was not lost on either of them that freedom had created complications that imprisonment had made irrelevant. As prisoners and refugees, their primary concern had been survival and reunion. As civilians with opportunities and responsibilities, they faced decisions that required balancing personal desires against professional obligations in ways that tested their commitment more subtly, but no less seriously than external obstacles had done. Their love story was entering a phase where success would be measured not by dramatic gestures or romantic sacrifice, but by the mundane compromises and daily choices that determine whether two people can build something lasting together. The real test of their impossible connection was revealing itself to be not whether they could overcome external opposition, but whether they could navigate the complex negotiations that all couples face when individual ambitions must be reconciled with shared dreams. The summer of 1946 would bring decisions that would determine whether their wartime romance could evolve into peacetime partnership, whether love forged in circumstances of crisis could sustain itself through the quieter, but no less demanding challenges of ordinary life. Their story had reached the point where fairy tale endings give way to the real work of building relationships that can survive the test of time and changing circumstances. The reunion they had dreamed of for so many months was finally within reach, yet both Elizabeth and Klaus found themselves hesitating at the threshold of decisions that would determine everything. The summer heat of 1946 settled over Germany like a blanket of possibility and uncertainty, carrying with it the weight of choices that could no longer be postponed. Elizabeth stood in her temporary quarters at the Frankfurt headquarters, holding two official documents that represented completely different futures. The first was a contract offer to establish and direct a medical clinic serving displaced persons near the French border, a position that would fulfill every professional aspiration she had developed during her years of wartime nursing. The second was a letter from Klaus describing his acceptance into Munich University's advanced literature program, an opportunity that would prepare him for the humanitarian work they had discussed during their precious days together. The geographic distance between these opportunities felt like a chasm that threatened to swallow everything they had fought to preserve. Yet both positions represented exactly the kind of meaningful work they had envisioned, the chance to transform their personal experience of finding connection across enemy lines into professional service that could help heal the wounds of an entire continent. Klaus faced his own moment of reckoning as he walked through the partially reconstructed streets of Munich, exploring the university district where he would spend the next 2 years if he accepted the academic opportunity that had been offered. The program directors had been impressed by his unique combination of military experience and literary background, recognizing that his perspective could contribute valuable insights to their research on post-conflict psychological recovery. But standing in the library where he would conduct his studies, surrounded by books that had somehow survived the bombing of the city, Klaus felt the absence of Elizabeth like a physical ache. The knowledge and skills he would gain here could enhance his ability to serve others, but what meaning would such service have without the person who had inspired his commitment to healing rather than destruction? Their letters during this period became exercises in careful negotiation, each trying to find ways to support the other's opportunities while protecting the connection that had sustained them through impossible circumstances. Elizabeth wrote about the clinic position with genuine enthusiasm, describing how the work would allow her to implement innovative treatment approaches for refugees who had been overlooked by larger medical programs. But between the lines, Klaus could read her uncertainty about accepting an assignment that would place her so far from his own pursuits. Klaus responded with detailed descriptions of his university program, explaining how the research opportunities could lead to positions with international organizations that would eventually allow him to work anywhere in Europe. Yet his letters also carried subtle questions about whether Elizabeth's clinic work might offer similar flexibility, whether the skills she developed there might transfer to positions closer to Munich. The correspondence that had once been their lifeline now became a delicate dance of mutual consideration and barely acknowledged anxiety. Both understood that this was the moment when their relationship would either evolve into practical partnership or dissolve under the pressure of incompatible ambitions. The romantic phase of their connection, sustained by separation and longing, was giving way to the more complex challenge of building a shared life from individual dreams. Their love story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, individual acts of courage and compassion can transcend the hatred that divides nations. Elizabeth and Klaus proved that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it encounters genuine need, that mercy can triumph over vengeance when we choose to see the person beneath the uniform. In a world that seems increasingly divided, their impossible romance offers hope that understanding between peoples is always possible, always worth pursuing, and always worth the risks involved.